Okay, let's pretend we live in a world where no one owned any land and no one accumulated any stock. In that world, there is only one real thing that can measure value, and that is labor. And we quantify it with what we call wages of labor. You work for an hour and then you sell whatever you produce during that hour for whatever that hour cost you. Now, in this world, division of labor still takes place. And naturally, because with division of labor, it requires less labor to produce things, things become cheaper. Remember, you're only ever going to be willing to pay for something if it's cheaper or the same for you to buy it than it is for you to make it yourself. So if the production of bread used to take an hour pre-division of labor, and then after division of labor it only took 10 minutes, then before the division of labor I would have been willing to pay an hour for it, and then after only 10 minutes. So in reality, after division of labor, things get cheaper. Despite this being the case in a landownerless, stockless world, things look like they're getting more expensive. This is a little bit complicated, so bear with me. Let's say that before the division of labor, it used to take an hour to make a loaf of bread, and it also used to take an hour to weave a basket. Therefore, at the marketplace, one loaf of bread was traded for one basket. And then the division of labor happened, and it helped baking become more efficient by being able to now produce 10 loaves of bread in an hour. But it only helped basket weavers by doubling their efficiency, meaning now they can make 2 baskets in 1 hour. So now 10 loaves of bread is worth 1 hour, which is also worth 2 baskets. So before the division of labor, the baker was able to come to the marketplace with his 1 loaf of bread and trade it for 1 basket. And after the division of labor, he now needed 5 loaves of bread. So it looks like it's getting more expensive, but in reality, it's actually getting cheaper, because before he used to be able to buy a basket for a whole hour, now he can buy a basket for half an hour, which means that the acquisition of a basket is twice as easy. Continuing in this imaginary world without landowners or stock investors is kind of pointless, Smith says, because these things were introduced long before any real implications of the division of labor were felt. And the second this happened, landowners and stock investors started demanding compensation for the use of their stuff, which makes sense, otherwise why would they invest it? On top of that, there are very few people out there that can maintain themselves without getting paid until their work is finished. Let's say that it takes a month for a weaver to make a blanket, and the sale of that blanket will give him enough money to cover both his materials and his cost of living for that month. But if he can't sell the blanket until he's finished with it, which obviously he can't, and that means he can't get money for it until he's finished with it, what is he going to eat during the month that it takes him to make the blanket? This is the reason that most people in the world work for someone else, so that they can eat. So if you're being paid a wage and you're fronted the money to cover the materials that you need, or given the materials that you need to work your craft, then you can make your craft and then live off the wages. The way you pay your investor back is with your production itself, and then they can sell it and make a profit. Slight side note, wages and profit can be compounded into the same person, which means that people can work for themselves and pay their own wages and their own profits and all of that wonderful stuff. This isn't very common though. Most people have a job and they work for a boss who pays them a salary. I mean, these days, larger companies, their bosses have bosses and their bosses have bosses. And depending on the size of the company, sometimes it's actually a corporation, which means that there are stock investors and they're the ones who get back the profits on the stock. But the idea is still the same. No matter how far out you extend this web, no matter the size of the company, very few people work completely independently. It's just not practical. What these workers get paid in the end is what we call wages of labor. In this chapter, Smith discusses the forces that contribute to what these wages of labor actually are. And he said ultimately what it boils down to is this constant struggle between what he calls workman and master and what we're going to call boss and employee. You see, employees are constantly going to be struggling to get paid as much as possible, and bosses are going to constantly be struggling to pay them as least as possible. And the way to foresee who's going to win this struggle? That's easy. Just look to see who's more desperate. How do you see who's going to be more desperate? Ladies and gentlemen, I give you the 2 forces that drive the entire economy: supply and demand. Labor, very much like any other part of production, is a commodity. If you are trying to make bread, you need the labor of the baker just as much as you need the flour. And so just like supply and demand dictate ultimately what is going to be the price of flour, they will dictate ultimately what are going to be the wages that you pay your baker. Our supply and demand in this case are obviously not going to be physical, tangible, countable commodities. Instead, it's going to be the amount of work available in proportion with the number of people willing to work. So you can think of the employees as the suppliers and the bosses as the demanders. Smith also points out that bosses are usually going to have a slight advantage in this battle because there are fewer of them, which means it's easier for them to combine and kind of cartel the wages. If employees want to get together, it usually involves some kind of violent outbreak, or at least it did in his days. These days we have unions and strikes and things that are a little bit more organized in order to allow employees to get together. But still, anything you try to do with more people is going to be harder to accomplish, and there's always going to be those few people who are willing to work for less. This is what Smith calls combining, and he says it's much easier for bosses to combine than for employees to do so. The one small caveat to this entire chapter is, though, that supply and demand do dictate the wages of labor and can point out to a general trend whether wages are going to be on the rise or falling. They can't really predict in any accurate sense what wages of labor are actually going to be. This is very different from regular commodities that you can just look up the chain and market forces will kind of make a general price for everything. Because wages of labor, particularly when you're going to the lower classes of society, very often have to do with the benevolence of the boss. Two factories that produce very similar items in the same town could be paying their laborers different wages. Also, you have to calculate into these employee benefits, such as full dental coverage. These kinds of benefits don't get calculated into the salaries, but they are part of worker compensation. Smith also argues that it's worthwhile for bosses to be benevolent and to pay their workers more and to treat them better, because they'll work harder. In fact, he goes on quite a rant arguing that the very idea that underpaying and mistreating your employees is going to cause them to work better is completely ludicrous. All you have to do to disprove that notion is to examine industries where employees are willing to work harder at higher risks, like mining. If the compensation is good, the risk is worthwhile to them. Zooming out again, though, you can really see the effects of supply and demand in action when you examine the economy and whether it's growing or shrinking. The laboring poor are in the best condition when the economy is actively growing, because what happens when the economy is actively growing is that stock investors want to open up new industries and there are more jobs available. Now remember that in short spans of time, population doesn't change much. So if the economy is growing and a lot more jobs are opening up, that means that there are less people to work them, which means that wages have to rise. In fact, he points out that a lot of people who have secure jobs might leave them in favor of looking for new work or branching out on their own because money is all around and it's kind of just abundant. But when the economy is shrinking, i.e. during a recession, all of these wonderful benefits are naturally reversed. Scarcity of work leads people to either keep or look for more secure jobs. And because it's a recession, bosses are willing to invest less, which means that there are less jobs available, which means that there's more competition for it, which means that workers are willing to get paid less, which means that they do. And before Smith draws to a close this ridiculously long chapter, he wants to squeeze in one more very important point. When you have less employees, then you have to pay them more, which means that in a commodity, the part that resolves itself into wages is more expensive, making the commodity itself more expensive. But when you have more laborers, not only does the part of the commodity that resolves itself into wages get cheaper, so therefore the commodity gets cheaper, but when you have more laborers, there's more opportunity for division of labor, which means that everything is more efficient, which means that it gets even cheaper. He says that this also creates divisions within the ranks of laborers. More people working on a single problem, meaning more heads are dedicated to making it more efficient. People who are better thinkers at this point will be better promoted. It's almost like it creates an entirely new society within society. Smith also dedicates a lot of space in this chapter towards establishing what is the lowest possible point to which wages of labor will sink. For clarity purposes, I have separated this into a completely different video. In the next chapter, Smith tackles a part of price that resolves itself into profit. If you don't want to miss it, subscribe. See you next week.